Now you will feel true pain.
You there!
You're watching Retro Reviews here on BlueNostalgica.com. Today's episode is sponsored by Encore Games. Encore Games for all your retro gaming needs. Visit a local retail outlet store today. And by Uncle Rob's Country Kickin' Chicken. Grab a box of that delicious batter dip goodness. On today's show, we take a retro step back in time to reflect on one of the greatest rivalries in video game history, Nintendo versus Sega, the console wars of the 90s. In the 90s, home gaming had reached a popularity unlike anything we had never seen before. And it's the console war between Nintendo and Sega that helped revolutionize the video game industry and lay the foundation of what we know gaming to be today. Before Sony and Microsoft, there was Nintendo versus Sega.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System?
When Nintendo first introduced its 8-bit home system, it took the market by storm. The term NES quickly became a household word, and by 1989, over 20 million people owned a Nintendo Entertainment System. More children were able to recognize Mario than could identify Mickey Mouse. Nintendo had dominated the video game industry. Then the era of the 16-bit machine began. While the TurboGrafx-16 even today seems to loom in the shadows, the advent of Sonic the Hedgehog brought new followers by the millions to the Sega Genesis. Sega quickly became a true competitor. Sales began to wane for Nintendo as people lost interest in the 8-bit market. Then Nintendo, after years of eager anticipation by consumers, finally released its own 16-bit system, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Meanwhile, however, many had decided that they couldn't wait. Sega had proved themselves worthy, and sales skyrocketed in the lag time before the American release of the SNES that many had begun to wonder if would ever be available. A good console does not a good game make, however. The best machinery in the world is worthless if the game isn't any fun to play. The key lies in the software. This is where the battle truly begins. Sega, without a doubt, has the one-up on programming experience and title base, but Nintendo is catching up fast. Initially, Sega was using a negative advertising campaign with the theme that the others just don't stack up. In other words, stating that Super Nintendo just didn't have the number of titles.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free.
What Nintendo?
Sega's battle against Nintendo in the late 1980s and early 1990s is best known as the first clash between Sonic and Mario, the speedy hedgehog with attitude versus the plumber with the Mushroom Kingdom's most famous mustache. But the skirmish only proved that Nintendo wasn't the only games firm capable of making money in North America after an earlier crash had wrecked Atari and other prospects. The contest also helped establish that console gaming wasn't just for kids anymore. Titles such as Mortal Kombat featuring blood and gore on Sega's platform and Gray Sweat on the more family-friendly Super Nintendo Entertainment System proved that targeting a more mature audience could be fruitful, as well as creating the need for gaming's first age rating system. They made it relevant to an older demographic. That was the start of a process that PlayStation later took one stage further. And if you look at the average age of a gamer today, it's now in the mid-30s. In 1990, Nintendo accounted for 90% of the US's $3 billion video game sector. 4 years later, Sega had leapfrogged it thanks to the popularity of the Genesis, the US name for the Mega Drive, though this was a feat that the company never replicated back home in Japan. The leader at Sega of Japan was very smart but very harsh, and he really drove the people there to be successful as their counterparts in America. I think that wore on them. Anytime that you're looking across the ocean at someone who is in a similar position to you and is doing better, I imagine there would be seeds of jealousy. He suggests that this explains why Japan put the second Sonic title on sale days ahead of Sonic Tuesday, which was an effort by the US squad to coordinate the globe's first synchronized launch of a video game.
あのソニックが新しい仲間テイルスを連れて帰ってきた。前作を超えたスケールとアクションで息もつかせぬ面白さ。超ハラハラ超ドキドキの超速アクション。ソニック・ザ・ヘッジホッグ2 Welcome to Sonic Land メガドライブから世界へ向けて。
Another, perhaps more important struggle was over hardware. Sega of America first tried to team up with Sony to create a Sega PlayStation, only to be told that Sega's engineers wanted to develop another console based on 2D sprite graphics rather than Sony's 3D polygon approach. Next, he attempted to link up with Silicon Graphics, the firm whose tech had been used to create the special effects in Jurassic Park and Terminator 2. But that too was rejected, allowing Nintendo to make use of one of the firm's chips in its Nintendo 64. When the Genesis successor, the Saturn, did launch, it flopped in the US, not least because developers found it difficult to code for, and Sony's machine was $100 cheaper. It's amazing that Sega and Sony had this opportunity to work together and take down Nintendo, but it ended up not working out, and Sony ended up benefiting from that in the long run. There's a phrase coined by a Nintendo marketing executive. The name of the game is the game. The idea is that the firm was obsessed by the quality of the titles released for its platform, leading it to impose restrictions on how many games other third-party publishers could release each year, and reserving the right to reject their work if it felt it didn't meet Nintendo standards. Sega deliberately took the opposite tack, resulting in it being able to boast a larger game library, even though it had more duds. Sega came on the scene and were very flashy. They certainly put an emphasis on style. Nintendo was more focused on gameplay, game development, and less so on marketing. This strategy appeared to pay off when the release of Donkey Kong Country helped Nintendo regain its lead over Sega just before the end of 1994. The biggest problem at Sega was the fact that they continued to release consoles that just didn't make any sense to the consumer. With attachments and add-ons such as the 32X and the Sega CD, which spawned some of the worst games in gaming history. This left a sour, burnt hedgehog taste in the mouth of all the consumers. To top it off, the Saturn was built on the assumption that all new games would still be in 2D, just with shinier sprites. Its dual-core setup was largely ensweeted to 3D, and it ended up being utterly trounced by the newest kid on the block, the PlayStation. The PlayStation ironically rose to the public consciousness in the exact same way that Sega had done years earlier, being sleek and not really a toy.
This is the day you have trained for, the day you have studied for. Utilize your superior skills, your superior intelligence.
Sit down,
Oh dear.
Oh, you were one.
Don't make me hurt you. Learn to defeat your ruthless enemy, Steve.
Sega tried again in the form of the beloved Dreamcast, but the damage was already done. The Dreamcast generation differentiated itself from the past by being a bona fide consumer electronics device, the PS2 by including a DVD player, and the Xbox by being bigger than the average bedroom. Sega left the hardware market to focus on third-party games and arcade machines, much as it had done in the early 80s. And considering Sega games since then, such as Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 and Sonic the Hedgehog Needs a Kidney, we can consider this as a rousing success. So when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, Nintendo once again stood tall as king of the mountain. Even though it plays third fiddle to companies like Sony and Microsoft now, Nintendo will always go down in history as one of the greatest gaming console makers of all time. Today's gaming community has no real war on their hands. Consider this, the PS4 and the Xbox One are really the same console. They have the same games, they have the same innards. One may be a little more powerful than the other, but they're the same shades of black. Sure, one produces a slightly more P, and difference so achingly unprofound you probably can't tell because you set your TV up wrong. But that's really it. So just stop. Come back when you've got a real console war on your hands.
Now you will feel true pain.
You there,